Now the podcast starts.
Hello, dear listener, and as you may know, this is the podcast on which sometimes we talk about horror, sometimes we talk about other things, and sometimes we swear. This is a quick introduction. I just want you alone for a moment before we go on to the main section of the episode, and you may be able to hear an evil-sounding bird squawking outside my window. Quite appropriate for a horror podcast, I think. This episode of the podcast, we're going to be talking to Catherine Bray, the British writer, critic and podcaster, not to mention old mate of Ian's, about her new podcast, Not Another Fucking Elf, which, well, I said sometimes we swear, we particularly swear on this episode. Her podcast is about the Lord of the Rings, and we're going to be talking about the phenomenon of the Lord of the Rings, which we decided was sufficiently horror adjacent. It's got scary monsters in it, demonic forces, and a couple of particularly frightening movies, and the discussion will mainly focus on Peter Jackson's 2001 The Fellowship of the Ring, which of course features Christopher Lee, another horror icon, but also Ralph Bakshi's quite alarming 1978 animated version of the same story. Before we get to that though, I just wanted to have a quick word with you about something that, well, might be coming up very imminently, depending on whether you listen to this podcast when it drops. You might have noticed we're dropping the episode a bit early this week. It's Friday, and this episode should drop in the morning. So, if you're listening to this on the morning of Friday the 27th of May, then this evening at 8:40 p.m, there will be in Manchester at Home MCR Cinema a very rare cinema screening of one of our favourite films on this podcast, the Spanish-made, English-language, Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee classic movie Horror Express, which Howard, myself and our special guest Tim Shaw spent nearly 3 hours enthusing about on our special episode of the podcast back in 2020. I'll put the link to that in the show notes, and if you've never seen the film and you can't make the screening, I believe it's also available at the moment on the BBC iPlayer, link in the show notes to that as well. If you want to get along to watch it, obviously I urge you to do so. I've never seen the film on the big screen. I'd deeply love to have the chance. Ironically, I won't be able to go myself because I will be actually in Spain this weekend visiting my brother-in-law Rick. But I urge you to take the opportunity to go and see it while it's being screened if you're nearby. And there will be links in the show notes of this episode so you know where to go and can book tickets. Back to the content of this episode. So the main discussion is going to be Catherine Bray joined by Ian, Stella and myself to talk particularly about the Lord of the Rings films, but about everything to do with the Lord of the Rings phenomena. And to be honest, you might get a sense that I'm slightly quiet in the discussion. I did feel as the discussion went on that maybe I was a little bit of a fraud because I discovered that I'm the only person in the group who'd not actually read the book The Lord of the Rings, although I have read The Hobbit. But the other three people in the discussion are much more knowledgeable about the subject matter than me, so I thought it's probably best to let them take it away. It was a lovely chat for us. It's very kind of Catherine to give us a generous amount of her time, and it's a great podcast that she and Paul Ridd present. It's a character guide. The full title is Not Another Fucking Elf, a Lord of the Rings character guide, and every episode focuses on a different character from the Lord of the Rings mythos and how they are depicted in the original literature and the various adaptations. So far, when we recorded this chat a few weeks ago, only a couple of episodes had come out, but now, as you listen to this, there will be more available. There are episodes about the characters of Gollum, Boromir, Bilbo Baggins, Legolas, and Tom Bombadil, and I'll put links in the show notes so you can find those episodes to listen to. It's a really erudite, interesting and fun podcast. They've really gone to town on their research, and their enthusiasm for the subject matter is infectious. So having said all that, let's have a listen to the trailer of the 2001 Peter Jackson film, The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring, to get us into the mood, and then we'll go into the discussion with Ian, Stella, and of course, Catherine.
Legend tells of a ring created by an ancient evil that gave its wearer the power to enslave the world. Believed lost for centuries, it has now been found.
Is it secret? Is it safe?
This is the One Ring, forged by the Dark Lord Sauron. Sauron needs only this ring to cover all the lands of a second darkness. He's seeking it. Seeking it all. His thought is bent on it.
No one knows it's here, do they? Do they, Gandalf?
The weapon of the enemy is a gift. Let us use it against him.
You cannot wield it. None of us can.
The ring must be destroyed.
It was made in the fires of Mount Doom. Only there can it be unmade.
I know what I must do, but I'm afraid to do it.
One does not simply walk into Mordor.
There is no other way. There's something down there.
Precious. Are you frightened?
Yes.
Not nearly frightened enough.
Okay, everybody, we are now here joined by the wonderful Catherine Bray, who is with myself and Ian and Stella to talk about The Lord of the Rings, both the 2001 Peter Jackson adaptation, but also the kind of phenomenon of The Lord of the Rings, and in fact her own podcast, which has a title which is going to force us to live up to very early live up to the warning that we tend to give at the start of this program that sometimes we swear. What? I'll hand it over straight to you, Catherine. What's the name of your show?
So we're called Not Another Fucking Elf, which in retrospect is a terrible title for a podcast because people listen to it and they think that must mean that we hate elves in all forms, but it's actually a tribute to a friend of J.R.R. Tolkien who apparently said this when the professor was reading out some of his latest work. That was Hugo Dyson just being a bit kind of sassy, so we thought we'd get a tip of the hat into him in our title.
Right, and I'm really glad you did, and I think it is a good choice of the podcast, because a good choice for a title of the podcast, because it means you have to explain it every episode, which you probably find a massive pain, but on the other hand means someone's going to learn something. I was one of the people who believed the myth that it was C.S. Lewis who said that, and I didn't know about Hugo Dyson, so
that's apocryphal.
Yep, I was educated within minutes of starting to listen to your podcast. So,
that's heartwarming. Great, we're winning hearts and minds. Love it.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic, and also it's very memorable. So okay, so Catherine, you're steeped in the lore of Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings, and I'd like to indulge you to talk about your knowledge and your starting point. We always talk about how we all got into the love of whatever movie we're talking about or whatever thing it is. But I think just before we come to you, if I ask Ian and Stella to also just give their histories with the Lord of the Rings, and then we'll all be on a sure footing with each other. So, should we start with you, Ian? What's your history with the Lord of the Rings as a saga?
Well, I fucking love it. Since it was probably after Jaws, it was probably the second novel I read. So I read Lord of the Rings cover to cover. I think I read it before The Hobbit. My mum had a copy from the 60s of an amazing, weirdly weird cover, and I just loved it. And I probably pretended to read it, and while I was pretending to read it, read it, and I don't know how many times I've read it, but not as many as Catherine, I would imagine, judging by how the fact that you seem to know so much about it. And sorry, your co-host name I had in my head. What's your co-host name, Catherine?
The lovely Paul Ridd.
Yes, Paul Ridd. Not to be confused with Paul Rudd, but just as lovely.
He gets a bit of that on Twitter, at Paul Ridd. I love you. I think you're amazing. It's like, you probably don't.
Because well, before we get on to that, but it just made me, as I said to you in an email, Catherine, it made me realise I am but an amateur when it comes to, even though it's been like 40 years since I first read Lord of the Rings.
Wow.
And I've reread it a lot, and I've loved the books, and I've loved the films. And I've read lots of stuff about it. Like Dan, your podcast still told me lots of stuff I didn't know. So I'm but an amateur. But I absolutely loved the books, and then I guess that got me inevitably into playing Dungeons and Dragons and all that sort of stuff, and liking just about anything that was a Tolkien rip-off as a kid. And so I just loved that sort of stuff. And then when the movies got announced, I was so excited because I loved Peter Jackson's Bad Taste. So I already kind of knew who Peter Jackson was. And I was just going, oh my God, this crazy horror director doing Lord of the Rings. And then it was when I was full-time, full-on, 10 movies a week film critic back then, and so Lord of the Rings popping in 2001 was like fucking hell, this is our generation Star Wars, and it really was. We kind of felt it was going to be, and then it really didn't disappoint. Like the day of the junket and watching it all in Leicester Square and all that sort of stuff. It was 20 years ago. It was pretty damn amazing. And so being there, I mean, I think they just finished. They said to us they just finished editing the print when we watched it at 9:30 in the morning, and then we had the junket, and so it was literally like hot off the press as a print, and as a massive fan, I just remember going up to Peter Jackson after the junket, like you're not supposed to do, and just shaking his hands and going, "I love Bad Taste," and he was so tired and so grumpy, and I'd like to meet him again when he wasn't tired and grumpy. But that briefly is my is why I just love these films, warts and all, because they've got some big flaws in them. But this first one, not so much. I think the major flaws come later, as we'll probably discuss. Anyway, Stella.
Let's listen to Stella. Although I appreciate the fact that Stella got a clang in there. Catherine, we always like to give Ian the chance to drop names in the podcast, but we always remind him by accompanying them with a clang. I understand that you
just make sure when Catherine does it much more impressively that you clang her as well.
It's just for you, Ian.
It won't be as impressive as going to the first press screening and seeing Peter Jackson. I'm so jealous.
Well, yeah, just the first press screening
Catherine, because
I was going to say, just being at the first press screening is impressive enough, but then to say you actually spoke to Peter Jackson.
He was grumpy as fuck, though, but I'll get on to all that.
Okay.
I'm sure he was just tired.
He was just tired, and I started gabbing at him about Bad Taste and Derek's Don't Run and all sorts of stuff to do with Bad Taste, and I think he was like, kind of want to pretend I haven't done that film.
Wow.
The one he should pretend he didn't do was the Lovely Bones, which I had the misfortune of attending, and then I ended up coincidentally in the same elevator as him at the hotel, and it was like, do I say that The Lord of the Rings changed my life, I love it, some of the films that mean more to me than anything in the world, or do I not, because then he might ask me what I thought of the Lovely Bones, and I'd have to be honest and say it's shit. So I didn't say a word. Did not say a word.
I've never seen the Lovely Bones, actually.
Just change the subject really quickly.
Not a good film.
It was a bit of, for me. It was. I mean, we're probably getting. Stella hasn't said her bit yet, but it was a little bit. I've really liked your stuff, and I'm delighted. And I'm sometimes complimenting directors. I don't know if you found this. Sometimes if you're just a bit too fanboyish when you're supposed to be a journalist, you step over a line. That's a bit like when they go, security. It's about to ask for an autograph.
Are you asking for a selfie? Because that's the word. Or I remember seeing someone asking Andy Serkis to record their voicemail in the Gollum voice for them, so that whenever anyone phoned them, it would be, hello. And he obliged. He was very, game.
Bloody hell.
He would have been well within his rights to throw the phone at the wall, I think.
Wow.
Yeah. Well, in 2001, I don't think selfie had been coined as a thing. But it's very much, as a journalist, you're not really supposed to ask. It's supposed to be a safe space for them, isn't it? A junket. But it did become a flurry of everyone asking for everyone's autographs. So, like, the PR's lost control of the journalists, of the press pack, and everyone was asking for autographs, and it was chaos. But fun chaos. But Peter Jackson looked tired, like he just literally finished doing a film, and now he's talking to a lot of wankers from the press. But anyway, Stella, Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, right. I read it at school. It was on. We had to read it. It was part of, in English Lit, and you went from one book to the next. Well, we did Lord of the Rings, so I did read it in high school, and it took us ages. But that's when I read it, and then it was kind of under the situation of being at school, so we're trying to, learn from it as well. So I don't really think I absorbed it that much. And then I forgot about it for years and years, forgot about all of it. And then when I went to uni in Sheffield, I was living with a guy who was obsessed with Lord of the Rings and anything with a dragon in it, all of that fantasy type stuff. So when it was announced that Jackson was doing the films, my friend Greg was super excited. So I was kind of just got caught up in his excitement, and I went to see it because we were all going to go and see it with Greg. So I probably would have gone and seen it anyway, but it was somebody else's excitement that I was kind of, that I was there for. And I can recommend that, because it's 20 years, isn't it, this year?
21 years, yeah.
21 years. Which is terrifying. But we all went to saw all three films after taking magic mushrooms, and it definitely helps.
Wow.
It's just like, it was really, really intense. But interestingly, I saw Bad Taste after Lord of the Rings a couple of years later. So I saw it the other way around. And I remember watching Bad Taste and being like...
That's a double bill.
I remember watching Bad Taste and being like, the Lord of the Rings fella did this? And then he did Lord of the Rings? Like, how?
It's mad, isn't
how
it?
is this? It's such... I mean, there are flashes of that in Lord of the Rings, I think. I'm sure we'll talk about it. But I just couldn't marry the two, particularly seeing Bad Taste after Lord of the Rings. And it's also beautiful and so emotional and all the stuff that it is. And then, I saw Bad Taste and I was fully shocked. That was Jackson.
Imagine have you seen Meet the Feebles?
No.
That's like his Muppet horror porn. That was one of the mad things when Lord of the Rings was coming out. I remember the TV schedules.
I think I'll give it a
miss.
miss.
Like someone had desperately gone, we'll show a load of Peter Jackson films, and it's like, well, he's done Heavenly Creatures. Oh my God, he hasn't done anything else that we could show. So they kind of showed Feebles and Bad Taste sort of late night on BBC Two. But Heavenly Creatures is amazing.
It is, and I'd also like to shout out. I'd also like to shout out for The Frighteners, which I think I had seen before The Lord of the Rings, and I think is a kind of unjustly forgotten great movie.
What's the other early one? Brain Dead.
Brain Dead is fantastic.
Oh yeah.
Brain Dead, yeah. And again, I think I saw Bad Taste, and then finally looked up. So, okay, so what films has this guy done? I don't really paid attention.
Yeah.
And then watched Brain Dead and was like, I can't. I can't put these two things together.
I kick ass for the Lord.
Nuts.
But it's just So he'd done all these weird. He was basically Sam Raimi, wasn't he? He was like a Kiwi Sam Raimi. And then a bit like Sam Raimi, they did huge Hollywood movies after doing very decent sort of horror movies. But I saw Bad Taste aged 18 with all my sixth form buddies in a double bill with Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which I hadn't seen before. And that I think that probably changed my life.
That's quite.
So I watched Bad Taste and I was like, wow, this is amazing. And then I watched Texas Chainsaw Massacre and I've never seen it since.
Very different kinds of horror movie.
Yeah.
I was like, I like that film. It was all right, and I never want to watch it again. Is how I felt about Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the original. But anyway, so I guess Catherine, onto you, and on your love of Tolkien.
My origin story. My family was always really big on the books. I think my dad read me The Hobbit when I was about 4, and then I read it for myself when I was 5 or 6, and then moved on to The Lord of the Rings. It's like The Hobbit's the sort of gateway drug, the thin end of the wedge, and then you progress to the harder stuff, the Lord of the Rings, and later the Silmarillion. But I was captivated by The Lord of the Rings. Read it very, very slowly at that age, just a little bit at a time. And then when I got to the bit where you think, we do spoilers in this section for The Lord. I mean, a book that's been out since the 1950s.
Yeah, it's fine.
I think we're all right. Yeah.
Yeah, I know your podcast is fully spoilery, isn't it?
Fully spoilery, yeah. So if you've not read The Lord of the Rings, Frodo goes up against this big old spider, and it's presented as a full-on fake-out Frodo is dead moment. And at the age of 8, I hadn't encountered any fiction that would do that to you. I don't think at that point. I mean, maybe some Disney, Bambi's mum, that kind of thing, but not the hero, like the guy that you're rooting for, the main one. I didn't know the main one could be killed off. And I stopped reading for about 2 weeks because I was so shocked and sad. And I remember saying to my dad, they've killed Frodo, what's going on? And he said, well, maybe you should read the rest of it. And I did, and then realised it was all a big swizzle. But I was so impressed by the way that he could pull the rug out from under you like that. Later on, obviously, the films come along. I was the perfect age for that. I was seeing a new Lord of the Rings film after the autumn term of university for my 3 years of university, which is just perfect for someone who was tracking the production of the films on the OneRing.net. I was big into writing Tolkien fan fiction at that time, the kind of the collaborative, multi-stranded sort of message board stuff where you write your bit and then someone writes their bit and all of your characters are kind of working together. I'm still friends with a guy called Snowdog who's I think maybe in his 60s or 70s and lives in Australia, like one of those internet friendships we've never met, but we're still in touch 20 years later. And so that was all really wonderful and very personal. I never thought it would be anything to do with my career. And then when I got a gig as a staff writer on Hot Dog magazine, little cult magazine that didn't last for that long, but just long enough to give me a job. I think it went out of business, owing a lot of people a lot of money. Bit of a shame. But yeah, Hot Dog, including him, yep. Left me out of a job as well at the age of 22 or something. But anyway, while it lasted, it was great. And one of my first assignments was to cover the Lord of the Rings all-nighter at the IMAX Waterloo. So I piled in there and wrote a kind of minute-by-minute diary of the experience of watching, I think it was the extended, so, that full cycle of, you come out at about 7 a.m, I think. Yeah. And wrote it all up for the magazine. And I'd made a joke about a guy who sat next to me and who had become increasingly ripe over the 12 hours. And I made some joke about him smelling like Jim Lee's jockstrap, which was very, very rude of me. And I wish I could take it back. But he wrote into the magazine to complain and identify himself as the man with the BO. And so we had to write him this big, long-winded apology and send him loads of Lord of the Rings goodies. So that was my introduction to getting cancelled in a pre-internet, pre-Twitter era. And I watch the films every year now. That's our New Year's tradition with my friend Paul Reid, who I have this podcast with. Yeah, I must have read the book. I mean, I've read the book every year since then, and some years twice, so I hate to think how many times I've read the book. But that is a bit of a poisoned chalice, because it kind of feels like if there's something I can't remember, then, boy, this woman must be really thick. How can you read a book that many times and still make any kind of error, you know?
It's all right. This is not a test.
Okay, good. I'm glad it's not going to turn into sort of mastermind. A spotlight will come down. Ian will be like, Catherine, here's your starter for 10. That's not the thing.
Oh, damn it! We didn't think of that.
Well, I know plenty of religious people that don't know their book. Claim to read it every day.
Well,
so Catherine, it's not just the books and the film, though, is it? Because what I really enjoy about your podcast is you seem to know in depth every version of the Lord of the Rings that there's ever been, and the format of your podcast is that each episode is a guide to a particular character. So far you've done an episode about Gollum and then an episode about Boromir, and you are taking everything that the book gives us about the character and then comparing the various portrayals in different media over the years, which is fascinating. Because I haven't heard it, I haven't heard or seen any other version apart from the Peter Jackson films. I've been meaning to get round to listening to the BBC one ever since it was repeated in 2001. But I couldn't. I think I missed the first episode, and it was in the time when, you know, if you've missed it, you've missed it. So I didn't listen to it, and I never got around to buying the CDs.
Oh, it's superb! It's amazing.
Yeah, I think one of the things we felt was that, like, we love the Jackson films, but they do get quite a lot of airtime. If you look up Lord of the Rings podcasts, a lot of them, you know, they're either about the book or they're about the Jackson films, and there's just such a lot of other stuff out there that we felt would be interesting to kind of compare and contrast. We don't even do all of it. We felt like you have to draw the line somewhere, so we generally do a shout out to the 1955 BBC radio adaptation, which is completely lost. You can't hear it anywhere. They didn't preserve the tapes, but it feels fun to do a sort of 21 gun salute and moment of silence for that version that we can't hear. Then we usually look at the 1979 Mind's Eye adaptation, which was a bunch of basically hippies in America. Lots of American accents in that one, which is really funny, I think, because we're just not used to hearing American hobbits and American wizards in a Tolkien context anyway. And then we look at the 1978 Ralph Bakshi animation, which is probably, I would say, the best known Tolkien adaptation of Lord of the Rings outside of the Peter Jackson films, when people talk about the animation.
I saw that at the cinema.
Oh, wow.
At the cinema.
That's a claim to fame.
As a tiny child, but my auntie, even more than my mum, loved Tolkien. So my main memory of it is loving it and being scared of it, and then it's all coming out doing Smeagol impressions.
I was going to say, it's quite scary for small kids, that one, with the ring wraiths. They're really eerie.
Yeah, it was the 70s. It was scary, but it was also a cartoon. But it was. But also quite not hippie parents at all, but also it's the 70s. There was a bit of a mustn't grumble, Derbyshire. Don't worry about it. So you know,
we saw terrible things in the war, and we turned out all right.
Yeah. Well, they were all war babies. They were war babies. Yeah, right. I was brought up by war babies, and so the idea of people being bothered about what kind of film you watched was very much, I was allowed to watch anything. Yeah. You know, bedtimes didn't exist. But did you see
the 1980 anyway. Rankin Bass one? Because that's the one that.
No, I've never seen that. That's I kind of was, until your podcast, I was aware of it vaguely, but I didn't really know what any of it was called. No.
That's kind of the one that people sort of haven't seen, I think, for whatever reason. It shares a lot of animators with people who would later go on to work at places like Studio Ghibli, so there's actually a bit of animation pedigree in there. And when you look at it and know that some of the people from Topcraft had that lineage, you go, oh yeah, okay, there is sort of like an anime thing going on here with characters like Eowyn. You can sort of see that crossover. But yeah, for whatever reason, that one doesn't seem to be generally as well known. Certainly not as well known as something like the 1981 BBC Radio 4 version, which people love, and has that lovely continuity with the Jackson version in that Frodo is played by Ian Holm, who goes on to play Bilbo, which is a lovely bit of casting. By
did you know? At the junket I mentioned before, because Ian Holm was there, we had Peter Jackson, Sean Bean, and Ian Holm. And Ian Holm, somebody asked Ian Holm a question about the radio version, and Peter Jackson went, "I didn't know that," so he didn't know.
No, was he not being ironic?
At that press conference, that Peter Jackson found out he'd hired a Bilbo.
Surely,
he'd hired a Frodo as his Bilbo.
Surely they were messing. I can't believe that wouldn't have come up during production.
Well, they were very good actors if they were messing. It was very much I didn't know that.
Well, Ian Holm is the coolest motherfucker for keeping that quiet for like 12 months in New Zealand.
Well, can you imagine with his career? He was probably going, "Oh yeah, I did do that, didn't I?" Because it's 1981.
Oh yeah, that's true.
He probably can't really remember, can he? 1981.
This may be my only opportunity to know something that maybe Catherine doesn't, but I thought that Brian Sibley, who wrote the BBC Radio series, did have some involvement in the film, like he wrote the making of book or something. So,
that sounds plausible, but...
Oh, hang on. I've got the making of book just there on the sofa. I'll go and get it.
Excellent. A primary source. Superb.
Oh, wow. It's like live research.
So if both he and Holm were involved and yet Jackson didn't know, they must have been playing it really cool.
You've now made me doubt my own past. So,
yeah,
I'm going to go through my box of audio tapes. That's how long ago it was. I was using an audio tape to record it.
Yeah, have you still got them?
Oh no! I used a big chunky thing with a proper C90 in it. Stupid. I used it way too late. Everyone else had digital things, and I was still tapes on the table, man. But yeah. So the films were just absolutely amazing, really, and it's really brought it home to me that you weren't actually professional yet. Then you were still a student. So it's because obviously I know you from Hot Dog, when I used to write for Hot Dog, and you, yeah, it's weird to think that was actually much later. So when Return of the King came out, were you a journalist then?
No, so I graduated that year, but no, hang on, let me think. No, Return of the King would have been my final year at university, and then I graduated that summer and came to work on Hot Dog. So, yeah. Wow.
Good. It really was. It really was. I'm not just joking. It's not just because it was. It really was pretty amazing having the Harry Potters and the Lord of the Rings and all these regular junkets and all these. And basically, it became a joke. I've got my yearly Hobbit because every year I had a bunch of. I managed to interview just every single person off Lord of the Rings. Over some of them over the phone, some of them at junkets. Some of them at round tables and stuff, and it was really amazing, like to be a film critic full time when those films were coming out. And they really have now 20 years distance. They stand up so well, don't they?
And do you know what happened? Obviously, prior to my time, but do you know what happened to Hot Dog during that time while you were going to your junkets and interviewing all these people? They got scammed.
Well, I didn't do it for Hot Dog because they got
scammed. They got scammed by someone who said that they had been to an early screening of Two Towers, like before anyone else, and Hot Dog could have the scoop. So Hot Dog ran a very early, very excited review of Two Towers.
I remember that, yeah.
That turned out to be utter bullshit from some chancer who, you've got the books there. You can sort of fake a review that sounds like you've seen it, but it was complete bullshit, and they lost a lot of credibility at that time. That really wouldn't happen now. It's too easy to check out who's seen what, whether there's been screenings. People are very connected, but at the time that could happen.
Yeah. Also, you'd be scared of running a review that's from a screening that hasn't happened yet, I guess. But it's I vaguely remember that happening. But all the big stuff I had to do for the regional stuff. I was editing a listings magazine in Newcastle, so I spent half my life in London, escaping Newcastle. And no offense to Newcastle. But obviously, Hot Dog only sent me, and those sort of assignments sent me to go and see the obscure stuff no one else wanted to watch. That was they weren't like gonna send a freelancer to watch Lord of the Rings. That would have been a staff job. But the Lord of the Rings films really. I remember I've got a copy of Empire. I was just looking at the other day from that time because I was looking at something I had in there. And it had like the first Empire review of Fellowship of the Ring, just as this happened, sort of serendipity. And it was just saying this is this generation's Star Wars. And I think it really is, like, just on the special effects level, on the impact level. Like, Peter Jackson's an absolute genius, cinematic genius. He really is. And it felt like that at the time.
Better than Star Wars for me.
Oh, it is. It pisses on Star Wars.
To be honest, even some Star Wars fans would agree with you. I remember a friend of mine, Steve, who Stella and I were at college with, who's a massive Star Wars fan. Somehow he saw Lord of the Rings before me and maybe before any of our friends, but I remember him coming back and just going, wow. That was my brother. He was a huge Lord of the Rings fan. You know, he's older than you, Ian. He's been reading, and I know it's hard to imagine. He's been reading and rereading that book for decades, and the film was just everything that he wanted. He could hardly speak. It was great. What a Christmas!
Yeah.
That's the reaction I had.
Yeah. Well, my friend Greg, whose excitement I got caught up in to go and watch it, he was the same. When we came out of Fellowship of the Ring, I reckon he might have cried at some point during that film. So it was just like, it was amazing. It's everything I wanted, because he was shit scared. He was like, what if it's rubbish? What do we do if it's rubbish? But he was thrilled with it. So,
well, I think maybe some of us in the geek sphere had been burned by Phantom Menace.
Yeah, which was only 2 years before.
Less.
So we knew not everything that we thought was going to be good would be good. Imagine if it had been like The Hobbit movies, which is a whole other conversation. But it was just literally there was this expectation, and then met by expectation, and then surpassed. Is like that cinematic blockbuster, just heaven, isn't it? In that type of movie, they're just near perfect films.
I've got to get back to editing our episode for the Not Another Fucking Elf, which we've done on Bilbo in a minute, and it's run massively over time, so I'm trying to hack it back to an hour and keep it at an hour. And one of the things I think we'll have to go is us just ranting about how bad the Hobbit films are for about 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Get rid of that.
I do fear if I start going down. I've not seen the
neither have I. So we
like I haven't seen any of the sequels after I walked out of Matrix. After I walked out of the second one, I've not been.
So
back.
we can't talk about it, Ian, because we're not qualified. We haven't even seen it.
No. And also,
excuse.
It will just be us ranting. I mean, it's hardly. I don't know. Anyway, we mustn't start talking about The Hobbit. We mustn't start talking about the Hobbit movies.
I did that thing. You know that Chris Hewitt famously gave 5 stars to Attack of the Clones for Empire magazine, and has since said, actually,
Empire's famous 5 stars.
Famous 5-star review.
They did that for Pearl Harbor as well.
And I kind of, not quite to the same extent, but I went on the BBC One film show at the time with Claudia Winkleman and gave a positive review to the first Hobbit movie. And I think it was just that thing of like wanting it to be good. It wasn't a 5-star rave, but I was kind of trying to find the things I liked in it and trying to minimise the things I didn't like in it. And all the while, that knot in the pit of your stomach where you're trying to convince yourself more than anybody. And then when the next film came around, I was like, it's not very good, are they?
Yeah.
Rushing.
Like, we wanted the experience again, didn't we, of being in the cinema watching, Tolkien's world and going, and when it wasn't, we're just like, yeah, that was great.
And part of it's worrying that you've grown up and that, like, maybe it's just not, it's you that's not enjoying this world anymore, and you've gone beyond it, but then you just go off and watch Lord of the Rings. It's like, no, actually,
it was your generation Star Wars prequels moment, is what it was.
It was.
Everyone would have to have one.
I watched Star Wars in the cinema as well, the year before I watched the Lord of the Rings animated, and it's to then flash forward and be an adult and get Phantom fucking Menace. All these years. But anyway, we will get sidetracked. We're here to talk about Fellowship of the Ring, which is a shining moment of glory in cinema history.
Well, just because I know that we've got limited time, I want to just bring a bit of focus to the discussion, because obviously we are a horror podcast, and our listeners expect horror content. So I just want to talk about how frightening the film is, really, and specifically the first film in the trilogy. When I saw it, I haven't seen the Bakshi film, but I had seen the first 10 minutes of that movie through my brother, the Lord of the Rings expert, and his vast collection, and I just wanted to have a look at it because I was in the hype for the upcoming release of the Peter Jackson film. And the start of the Bakshi film is the flashback to the creation of Gollum, isn't it? And I just thought, that's absolutely terrifying. Those glowering red skies and use of silhouettes and things. I thought it was incredible, and I kind of took that into the viewing of the first film with me, which worked because you hardly see Gollum in the first movie. It had a bad knock-on effect in that when we eventually did see the flashback to Smeagol in the third film, I found it relatively disappointing. It's relatively prosaic, but the first film is still my favourite of the movies because I think there is such a sense of doom in it. The Black Riders are so frightening. The other movies are great as well, but the fact is that good is starting to win from kind of early in the Two Towers. I think there's and it's all kind of battles from there, but the real sense of overwhelming evil, I think, is in the first film when it's this small band of hobbits who don't seem to really have a chance in hell against this ancient force, and it leads. The film, of course, ends with the dissolution of the group, so it's just kind of steeped in danger, really.
Yeah, well, would you agree, Catherine? Because I remember as a kid reading Lord of the Rings over and over again, but Fellowship of the Ring, enjoying it much more as a book. It's people on a quest. And it has a really good ending. Even though it's weird, it was only when I watched the film and realised, oh no, that's from the beginning of the second book, the whole Boromir's death but when you read, I don't know if anybody ever read Lord of the Rings as one book. I've only ever seen it as a big chunky tome anyway.
I was just going to say, I didn't think of them as like sort of separate books when I was reading it as a kid, because it was just this enormous book that I could barely carry.
No, I never did.
But I think the first book is more of a horror book. The only chapters that are actually that I used to have the light on, like the big main light instead of the little night light on to get through, was A Knife in the Dark, and also the Barrow-wight sequence, which isn't in Jackson's film, and I know it must have been something that was a wrench for him to cut, because it's basically a big, spooky, horrible, undead thing that nearly kills all of the hobbits in a terrifying sequence. I know for a guy like Peter Jackson, it must have been really difficult to lose that. It has to go because it is a bit of a sort of side diversion, but it's one of the most pure horror sequences, I think, in that first book. And I think the first book is more of a pure horror novel than any of the later ones, which move into that more sort of high romantic heroism kind of mode for a lot of it. Like, there's nothing scary about Aragorn going up against all of those orcs, because it's more like a military campaign, I think.
Yeah.
I think there's just something more pure about the storytelling as Tolkien's setting off on his quest. Maybe it's just that season 1 is always so often the best season of anything.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I love all of the later stuff, but it's not delivering horror so much. It's delivering different stuff. As you say, the vulnerability of the hobbits when they're on their own, they don't have Gandalf, and they've got Strider for the Ringwraith stuff, but they haven't got Strider at all early on when they first just see a Black Rider, and they're still in the Shire. That bit shits me up as much as anything else, really, because it's so out of context when you've just come out of the grubs, chubs, boffins, bulgers, hornblowers, chubs, all of those crazy hobbits at Bilbo's 111th birthday, and then suddenly there's this guy in a cloak asking for Baggins. It's a real context shift, and I think that's one of the creepiest things about it.
Yeah. I think my daughter's 13 now, and I showed her Lord of the Rings, I don't know, maybe she's like 6, 7, I don't know, whatever. So at some point when she was a bit smaller, and it was only with the Ringwraiths that I remember sort of sitting and looking at her on the sofa and making sure, like, she all right with this bit? The rest of it was like, yeah, fighting and this and that's the other, and the lovely elves and all the other stuff was going on, but it was with the Wraiths that I had to be going, is this a bit strong? Or is she all right? But no, she was just like, she's like, this is brilliant, and she loved it straight away. And we rewatched it actually on Sunday for this, and she said, can we start the second film? I was like, well, no, so I'm going to talk about the first film on Thursday, and I'll get confused. So she's itching for us to shut up so that we can put the second film on.
Oh wow, that's brilliant.
But yeah, it was the Wraiths that had to make sure it wasn't too much.
Yeah, no, I started watching it a few weeks ago with my youngest, who's 6, and the Ringwraiths was the bit when we had to turn it off. So he was all right, and then when they get to the bit where they're like stabbing in the bed, and even though they're stabbing pillows, he just couldn't make it through to find out everyone was all right. He was like, no, it's too much. So I probably put him off Lord of the Rings. I mean, I was like, I watched Bakshi when I was 6.
I imagine for children I don't have kids, but like the practical effects, I would imagine, are scarier than digital effects, because they just look like something is actually there and happening, and you put all of those Jackson touches, like the Ringwraiths' feet and hands making the earth boil with insects, and like some of those insects are real or they look real. And I think it's something like 300 and something VFX in Fellowship. There's over 1,000 VFX in Return of the King, and somewhere in the middle in Two Towers, like 600 and something. So the number of digital effects is just ramping up across the trilogy, and I think that does sort of have a knock-on effect of Fellowship being kind of one of the scarier ones, because just everything feels more tangible and like it's really happening.
I think, we mustn't talk about The Hobbit, but I think maybe you can see the seeds of why The Hobbit's trilogy didn't work, because the first film works just on so many levels. Like the final battle is, it's a crane shot, and it's people with latex masks on and big swords, and
stunning,
people getting hit with, Boromir getting filled with arrows. You don't feel the video, you don't feel the CGI in a bad way, and if you do, that's amazing CGI because you don't notice it. And the computer programs that make battles that became what people talked about in the later films, and then the CGI that doesn't look real at all, that is the curse of the Hobbit films. So maybe, so I remember even before I'd seen the film, I so I was in Newcastle. Billy Boyd was in a hotel room, so I interviewed Billy Boyd. That was my first clang. Yeah, that was my first sort of interaction with the film. So I was excited, but talking to Billy Boyd, who just he was reminiscing about he just made 3 films. He didn't know how they were going to go down. But I've got a tattoo, and I had an amazing few years in New Zealand. But this actor who maybe was about to have his life changed, maybe not. And we were just talking, and I was talking about Bad Taste to him as well. So he was like, "Oh, I love Bad Taste," but he was just reminding me that what a genius Jackson is. That some of it, because obviously he was talking about the Treebeard stuff that was in the later films and how that was done like 1930s King Kong and CGI. So Jackson's genius was to know which tool to use from the movie making box while inventing new tools himself, with the computers and everything. So it was guys in latex masks with steel swords that makes it so real. It was old-fashioned special effects and splatter gore and stuff he'd learned from a beheading. This is how you do a beheading. This is how you make blood spurt. Here's a massive hand, and then all the CGI on top of all that. That's what makes the films just on an effects level.
And great casting too, great horror casting. People like Christopher Lee and Brad Dourif got that, that real heritage.
Yeah.
Yeah, only really twigged with me when we did the Exorcist 3 pod that Brad Dourif, like, where I'd seen him before, suddenly went, oh, of course. That's why he's doing his Zodiac Killer. Not Zodiac Killer. What's it called? The Killer. Anyway.
Knockoff of
Zodiac.
The Gemini
Killer. He's Chucky as well. So you've got the voice from Child's Play.
I've never seen Chucky. I don't know how, but I've never seen Chucky.
There's a Miss Classic we could do.
Well, maybe.
Do a double bill with One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, like from his breakout. Ridiculous.
Yeah, but the castings. That was something that Peter Jackson was asked a lot about, and he didn't like talking about it. Was Stuart Townsend?
Oh, it was Aragorn.
Having been cast as Aragorn, and then he was just miscast. It wasn't his fault, and we'll probably never know exactly.
I don't think it's not his fault that he's like 20 years too young for the role. So I do think someone fucked up on production side, because you're not going to have that gravitas at that age. It does need to be somebody older. Thank Christ they sort of had the cojones to realise and recast, as gutting as it must be for that actor. I think it would have really sunk huge chunks of the film if you had a 20-year-old kid in the role of Aragorn. It's just wrong.
Every review would be, it's all right, but why is Aragorn so young? And Viggo Mortensen is just something else. He's just like,
he's perfect.
He's very pretty, isn't he?
Well, I wasn't saying that, but, so I understand. Fair enough.
His hair gets worse, though, across the trilogy. Those wigs they've got him in by the end of Return.
It's not a good wig at the end, is it? It doesn't look right because at the end, that sequence when he's crowned king and his hair's all clean, it's like he's had a shower, and it's like, it's not as good.
No.
You like your Viggo dirty?
Yeah.
I've never noticed the wigs, I must say. I think I've just always swept up, and I've never really noticed these bad wigs. But that was one of the things to talk about as well. Was Lord of the Rings is very, very much a male story. As in, are there any female characters in it apart from Galadriel?
Arwen. Shelob is a female character.
Oh yeah, the spider. Yeah.
Representation.
So there's a spider and an elf queen in the actual novels that aren't in the appendixes.
And Goldberry.
Oh, Goldberry.
Goldberry is Bombadil's wife. She doesn't get a look in the Peter Jackson version either.
No.
But no, I don't know. I mean, as a kid, I was identified with Frodo. I think It's
Yeah.
just one of those films where you're identifying along other lines than gender, because the whole thing is so far removed from, I presume, our actual experience. Unless any of you have ever had to lob a piece of jewellery into a volcano.
Not that I can remember. So, yeah.
No.
But yeah, it's interesting with Tolkien and representation, I think, because like the guy was born in the 1800s. So is he going to write something that by 2022 standards looks perfect through any of those kinds of lenses? No, he's absolutely not. But I don't think that means that there's not tons of value in.
Oh no, totally.
Yeah.
But also, I mean, he was also writing from the point of view of someone from the, from, I guess, at least pre 1066. He never got over 1066, did he? That's when everything went downhill in this country.
Well, he was big rivals with his bit of the Oxford English kind of lobby, as it were. They sort of cut off around Chaucer. Like for them, it's Chaucer and earlier in literature is the stuff that's worth studying. And they had this kind of big, almost Sharks versus the Jets style rivalry with the people who were later than Chaucer, so Shakespeare onwards. And initially, C.S. Lewis was kind of from that lot, so they weren't pals to begin with. I'm a bit suspicious of you because you like Shakespeare and all that modern lot. Literature, but...
I've never heard anything so English in my life.
Yeah. A beautiful, unlikely friendship across the divide.
Oh, that's lovely.
But that was very much one of his things for Lord of the Rings, was for basically making a sort of mythical past that had somehow been erased or had never existed, or the Beowulf type era of the oral tradition that hadn't survived.
And in his mind, the Silmarillion mythos was just as important as the Lord of the Rings. Obviously, it was not as popular with readers, and there's actually a lot of really interesting female stories in there. So I feel like he was probably kind of like, but come on, I've written just as many interesting female characters over here. It's like, yeah, but that is the bit that you've written like a chapter of the Bible, so people aren't as interested in it because the textual style is really hard to get to grips with compared to the Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
He shot himself in the foot a bit there.
Yeah. So I think the introduction of Arwen as a character is a stroke of genius from the screenwriting team. So am I right? You're the expert, Catherine, but am I right? That's from an appendix that's in Lord of the Rings, or is it an appendix that's from the Silmarillion?
So Arwen pops up. Well, basically, they take Glorfindel's adventure and they give that to Arwen. That's always been a problem for the adaptations, because in the book, they're making their way to Rivendell. Frodo's been wounded. Black Rider's on their trail. Peril. And then Aragorn's mate, Glorfindel, an elf prince, shows up on his horse to help out. And it's all very convenient. And they all get to Rivendell. And then Glorfindel, I think he's at the Council of Elrond. But then you never hear much about him for the rest of the book. So particularly if you're adapting it for a movie, it's like, why are we going to have this guy show up for 10 minutes and then never be heard of again? And so when they adapted it for the Bakshi version, they have that role fulfilled by Legolas. So it's actually Legolas who shows up, and they introduce him at that point, who is voiced by Anthony Daniels, who Star Wars fans will obviously know and love as C-3PO. So you have C-3PO show up to the rescue to help them get across the board and escape the Black Riders. And Jackson, quite sensibly, instead, he has Arwen in that role, which is a really nice way of kind of introducing the romantic dynamic between her and Aragorn. Good way of getting her into the story and getting rid of this, from an adaptation point of view, sort of useless character who's not in there for long enough to be interesting.
And she's a badass in that scene as well, isn't she?
She is, and
she's great.
It's incredibly tense. It's a great introduction. It continues the theme of just kind of vulnerable people fighting evil. This where she's on the horse alone, being chased across the fields by hordes of the ring wraiths. That's just an incredible edge of your seat sequence, I think.
It's another one of those sequences I really miss in modern blockbuster filmmaking. Is I think you just get far fewer sequences like that where you, like 10 horses. That is hard to film, and I feel like a lot of the blockbuster filmmakers now just would swerve that, and they wouldn't have that in there. It's complicated, it's expensive, it's difficult to shoot, but Jackson did shoot it, and it really, on camera, it just shows how exciting it is.
It's so exciting because we watched it again on Monday, and it was sequence like that, and the sequence of the fight in the woods at the end, and just when it's just so, you feel so in it that you're right next to them, you're right in the action. There's that beautiful shot when Arwen's riding away and there's the 9 horses behind her and they're all fanned out behind her and they're turning all these corners, and I'm sat on the sofa just eating my bank holiday Monday pizza, having a lovely afternoon. But I've realised that I was leaning forward with excitement, and I've seen the film God knows how many times. I was, watched it over and over again before I showed it to my kid. And, Ian, you'll know, when you show a kid a film and then they love it and you have to watch it 50 times in a row, and every time they want to put a film on, it's that same film. So we watched Lord of the Rings over and over and over again, and I don't think we've watched it for about 5 years. So it was really lovely to put it back on and for it to still be super excited and go, yeah, we're going to watch them all again. We watch the Hobbit ones. Yeah. Maybe not. But it's just so exciting. Still.
If you get hooked on The Hobbit, you'll have to watch that over and over again. That's the downside of that.
Oh, well, she's 13 now, so she's too cool for that now.
It's I just think just as a introduction of Arwen, it's one of those things that's so good that it's hard to imagine the story without it now. Like when Amazon are doing Lord of the Rings, but not Lord of the Rings, they're doing Tolkien.
It's a weird prequel or something, isn't it? I don't even know what it actually is.
Well, isn't it based on the Silmarillion, the Amazon?
It's the Second Age, so it's not even they haven't got access even to kind of everything that's covered, I don't think, by the Silmarillion. It is legit Tolkien. I don't know. I'm just kind of keeping an open mind about all of that, and we'll see how it turns out.
I just hope it's really good.
Is it out? Has it been finished?
No, it's not out. It's been bubbling under for years now, isn't it? And then there's been COVID.
Trailers have started to appear, haven't they? I've seen some.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
But I was just saying about Arwen is if anyone comes to adapt Lord of the Rings again, it's hard to imagine Arwen. It's a bit like the balcony in Romeo and Juliet. It's a bit like it's an introduction that feels so perfect. And
it's tricky with those characters that are really like ancient elves and so on, because this Second Age they've had to cast people playing roles that were previously played by Kate Blanchett and Hugo Weaving and the guy in the Sauron outfit. Okay, we don't know who that is. But yeah, they've had to find people who can embody that. And I wouldn't want to have to try and kind of live up to what Kate Blanchett did as Galadriel.
No, yeah.
No.
Oh, don't give her the ring, for God's sake.
That is my favourite scene in the film as well.
So good.
Oh my God! Just when you start thinking how many amazing people are in these films, you forget about Kate Blanchett. Kate Blanchett is amazing. There's just so many good people in these movies, and that's another reason they're 20 years on and they're still there's barely a moment in that looks dodgy, that doesn't stand up. I don't think.
On the stairs doesn't look good.
In Moria.
Yeah. That bit bugs me. I have to kind of.
That bit annoys me too. I'm so glad you said that. It just looks like something out of the wrong kind of film. It's like Indiana Jones shit in Moria, where Aragorn's like lean forward, and you're meant to believe that the way to the tiny hobbit is making the column of stone that's been there since the Balrog first crawled out of Morgoth's dungeon. In the right direction.
Yeah,
it's like...
just if you watch that sequence, you can see the blue outline around the characters, so that they don't. It's not been drafted properly into the background, or the tech wouldn't allow them to do it, and that's the only bit that makes me sort of go, but
it doesn't look right, and it's also just not a necessary narrative beat. They're already fleeing orcs and a Balrog, and will they get out?
They're on the run.
Time. Got enough tension.
There's enough going on. Yeah, the Balrog's coming, the thing's falling apart, there's arrows flying everywhere. Like, you're all right, but the look of it it makes me grind my teeth a little bit. But it's all right because the Balrog's like there 30 seconds later, and that's amazing. So it still looks incredible.
I mean, that's just that. I mean, again, this is. I remember watching the press screening of it. Well, not actually just the press screening. I took my girlfriend to see another press screening at a more godly hour, and she didn't know what happens to Gandalf, and so that was amazing. Like, she was so invested in it. She went, no, like full on, and she was like, "Is he dead?" I was like, "Yeah, he's dead." And it was like,
you bastard.
It was literally gutted, absolutely gutted. That whole sequence. I remember since I kind of weird. I probably imagined it, but I remember reading Fly You Fools in the book and just being absolutely gobsmacked that Gandalf was dead, and a bit like your Shelob moment. But it just absolute perfection for me. I mean, I guess I've never ever worried about the stone thing, and but I guess it is a seed of we're going to have surfboarding Legolas coming up, and we're going to have the Hobbit movies coming up.
Stella, you said you'd like to talk about the effects a bit more, so I thought maybe this was a good segue into that, because it sounds like you've just mentioned the only one you're not happy with, so maybe you could talk about the others.
So as I said, you can see the blue line around them, which is it's because everything else in the scene is orange or brown. That demarcation line to me is just like it's just humming at me, but that's what the tech could allow at the time. So the reason I wanted to talk about the VFX is kind of work based. So I teach a module that's essentially landmarks in VFX. So Lord of the Rings is obviously in there, various other bits of like 80s high concept cinema in there, blah blah blah. But I have the Lord of the Rings in there because it's really useful. While it did turn to more CGI over the course of the first 3 films and the following Hobbit films, it's like I said, the Fellowship has got the least CGI in it. Each film developed its own method of technology. So the program that they built to make Gollum, to do Gollum's eyes or the geometry inside his eyes, they created the subsurface scatter light. So the animation of Gollum has a reflection of light on his skin and underneath his skin, so that it looks more real. And nobody had done this before. So every film, even though they're increasing the CGI, perhaps a little bit too much at times, they're creating just a series of firsts every single time. They're the first film to do this skin texture. They're the first film to have a CGI character interact with real life. The first film to do motion capture. So all the way through the series, it's just the first one of this, the first one of that. So for my students that do VFX and post-production, to watch the development of the skills in the CGI, in the post, in the VFX across Lord of the Rings and across The Hobbit is really useful for them to see it changing within the universe to keep it still hopefully looking the same. And there are changes, there are things where you think, I wish that hadn't been CGI, but it is. And it's just incredibly useful to see this progression, to watch the progression of Weta Workshop with their practical effects, and then to watch the progression of Weta Digital and how much they learned, how much they created. And you see similar things with things like, was it Gravity with Sandra Bullock? They did the first, the fully round video screen for her to be filmed inside. So, when films do these first, it's always worth pointing to. And with Lord of the Rings, and again with The Hobbit, even though we're not going to talk about The Hobbit, each film had its own, we created this specially for this film, and now everybody uses it. And it's just, the films are emotional, and they're amazing, and they're exciting from that point of view, from the production, from the tech involved, and from the skill and the learning that everybody went on. It's amazing stuff. And I think I can't help but look at all those bits and go, Oh, that's a nice bit of rendering on that one. that one there, it looks really nice. Well, that's really well matched, isn't that? Look at that light scatter on there. It's lovely. And Owen's just like, oh my God, watch the fucking film.
I love that. I love the idea of you're there sort of watching with all of this kind of technical expertise. I'm there crying my eyes out because they've gone into the West. And you're understanding it on a landmark tech level.
Yeah, well, it makes me maybe not the best person to go to the cinema with. So I like to point that out. But in my defence, do you know what I'm talking about? But also, I have to put up with my husband. He's a circus performer, so when we go and watch circus stuff, he'll sit there going, I can do that. So there is a bit of crossover. We can irritate each other in each other's respective fields. So
we had a thing at university, so in the middle of when the films were being released, where for drama club you could go and do a fight workshop. Ooh. And they got one of the guys who was one of the models for the Balrog, and all I wanted to do was just ask him questions about being the Balrog.
Oh, that's cool.
And he had that same thing of watching movies through the lens of his expertise, which was fight performing.
Yeah.
And I always remember he said, do you know what the best film of recent time, the best fight in a film of recent times is? And everybody had a thought and came up with various, mostly quite kind of violent movies, action movies, all that sort of thing. And he said, for me, it's the scene in Bridget Jones' Diary where Hugh Grant and Colin Firth kind of go at it like proper yuppies in a fight, like they don't know how to fight. It's messy. They're scrambling around, they're rolling in someone's birthday cake, and then he was so cross because he said, and then they ruin it. They have them go through a plate glass window.
It's in the restaurant, isn't it?
And then they get up and dust themselves off. And up until then, it's been a fight that's completely in character for these two guys. But they're not action men. They're not going to go through a plate glass window and then pick themselves up again. They'd be
rolling on the floor, going, "Oh!" It's really undignified, isn't it? It's just like a scuffle. It's not really a fight, is it? Because they can't fight. Because when you were saying that, it's like, what's the best fight? And my brain immediately went to maybe the Bourne Identity films, or those really fast-paced fighting, or maybe, I don't know, Old Boy. That's got some great fights in it. But
it's a man with a magazine.
But Anna Byron. But
no, he loved that one because he said it's just that's how men like that, middle-class men who don't fight often
will do it.
Fight.
Interesting. Right, I'm going to write that down. That's going in a lecture. I'm having that.
Yeah.
And so it's the Balrog, supposedly. I don't know whether they had multiple Balrogs and he was, the
whole
main
team
one,
of
or
Balrogs.
a side Balrog or what.
Don't
but
know.
He was something.
Shall I consult the book? Hang on.
Yeah, great.
Just say something.
Actually, it won't help because I can't remember his name. But
there was one thing about the sort of some of the choices they made. I mean, they did so many things right. It's weird. There was an article I remember reading in the Guardian. Because of the magic of the internet, it was really easy to find it again. So it was an article from 2001 by John Ezard, who I then discover is sadly no longer with us. But he knew Tolkien, and it's an article. We'll have to put a link to it on the podcast notes. And he just wrote, "Would Tolkien like Fellowship of the Ring?" None of the other films had come out. The Hobbit was put a gleam in Jackson's and Guillermo del Toro's eye, and he sort of said, basically, Tolkien, grumpy as he was, would maybe just about like the movies, but the one thing he wouldn't like was the fact that they seem to have, instead of being English, they seem to be Irish. And he's got this brilliant quote from grumpy old Tolkien saying, "I do know Celtic things, and I feel for them a certain distaste. They are, in fact, mad." Yeah, he said in 1937. So that was this guy's main thing, was the Irish. The soundtrack's very Irish, which he puts down to Titanic being successful, and the Hobbits are Irish people doing jigs and things, which rather than English people, because that was the whole thing about Tolkien. He's very English, not British English, and but it's a really nice article. Just sort of he'd been to see them premiere, and he basically just said, trying to watch this through the eyes of the professor I knew, who he knew a few times, and he said mostly he'd probably approve, which is a nice thing to feel.
It is.
Although he'd probably complain about the, like you say in your podcast, Catherine, he's not happy if you change a bloody comma, really.
Well, the level of detail that the man put into working out. So here's an example of something that Tolkien actually went away and worked out. And I don't think I know of any other fantasy author who is this fully realised from their creation of their fantasy world. So he maps out all of the events of Lord of the Rings against the calendars that he's come up with. He maps them out against the phases of the moon as they would be playing out within that time scale. So if a character in the Lord of the Rings is looking at the moon and they see a full moon or a half moon, that is the moon that there would have been within that time scale. So what
a nerd.
When he he looked at things like treatments for proposed film versions that kind of never came to fruition, and he would pop off about all sorts of details. It was sort of things like, I've actually got one on the computer here where he says, "I am sorry, but I think the manner of the introduction of Goldberry is silly and on a par with Bombadil as an old scamp. It also has no warrant in my tale. We are not in fairyland, but in real riverlands in autumn. Goldberry represents the actual seasonal changes in such lands. Personally, I think she had far better disappear than make a meaningless appearance." And he writes a whole letter with that level of notes all the way through. He would have found shit tons of stuff that would have bothered him intensely, I think. I mean, I love the Peter Jackson versions, but I think Tolkien would have probably have been very unhappy with them.
Well, the thing that really got me in your podcast on Gollum was I was like, I'd never thought about it before, but I almost started feeling offended on Tolkien's behalf when you play the MTV the circus as Gollum at MTV, and I was like, oh my god, no! What are you doing? This is a sacred character.
I think it's probably like the ultimate example of something that would have offended Tolkien. But it's so this is when Andy Serkis is accepting an award for the best CGI creation, obviously, which has gone to the creation of Gollum, and they've recorded this bit with Gollum himself showing up to complain about his treatment at the hands of Weta Workshop and so on. And he drops all sorts of bad language. He calls Andy Serkis fat, and I think for Tolkien, he would have been like so disrespectful in his mind.
Oh dear. Well,
it's a bit cringy.
It's mine. I won it. It was me. We only won because of me. And me. MTV is my friend. My friend. You don't have any friends. Nobody likes you. Gary likes me. Gary's a f***ing
That's enough, Gollum.
Piss off, Circus, you stupid fat with a turd.
Quick insert from editor Dan here, just to say that was but a short snippet of the whole fairly grueling clip of Andy Serkis and Gollum at the MTV Awards. If you want to hear the whole thing, please go over to Catherine and Paul's podcast. They've got the whole clip in their Gollum episode, which will be linked in the show notes. Cheers! So we're coming to the end of our time now, and I think it's a good time to talk a little more about your podcast rather than the books and the films. As Ian and I were saying earlier, we know a thing or two, but we were both learning lots just by listening to your podcast. I was delighted I think it's in the Gollum episode, because each of your episodes is devoted to a different character. You played an excerpt of Tolkien himself reading Gollum, or reading the book, and you commented on the fact that it's almost as if The Hobbit was kind of written to be read aloud. It's a story to be read to children, and I felt really vindicated, because when I read The Hobbit, even though I was like 18, I read it aloud to myself because there's just something about it that it worked better when I did that, and it kind of reminded me a little bit of sort of scriptural stuff, which I'm a Catholic. I'm used to hearing scripture readings in church, so it's just not the same if you don't hear it. So by the way, listening to your Gollum episode also reminded me something that I haven't thought about for years, which is that I am a Gollum. I wish I could have let you know this in advance. I played Gollum in a student production when I was 18, and the reason this was before I'd read The Hobbit or the films had come out. So the meme of Andy Serkis's voice was not common. I didn't know what I was doing. I just had to make it up. And the director of the show very kindly afterwards gave me a copy of the book The Hobbit to read, which is why I was reading it. I wish he'd given it to me beforehand, but never mind.
That's amazing. Does the recording survive at all of your Gollum?
No, I'm afraid not. It's barely even in my memory.
One thing your podcast sent me down a Google rabbit hole, because when I was 18 at Derngate Theatre in Northampton, where I live, we went to see The Hobbit stage play, and one of the main memories of that is how sexy Gollum was. Gollum was played by a woman with a really good figure in a really tight-fitting bodysuit, and we were all just like laughing our heads off the whole time, going, I fancy Gollum. Do you fancy Gollum? Yeah, I fancy Gollum. So we're laughing a whole way through this Gollum with a really curvy, really nice female form. Wasn't quite right. It was just such a weird production as well.
Wow, that sounds amazing.
That's very funny.
But yeah, sexy Gollum.
Was Ian? Was it a musical? Wasn't there a stage musical of The Hobbit? Or have I imagined that?
There was the Lord of the Rings, I think.
I don't remember there being. Do you know what? I other than the songs that were in the book, I don't remember there being songs.
Okay.
But I did look it up, and there did seem to be a few stage versions mentioned. But I definitely saw it in 1990 at the Derngate Theatre, Northampton. And unless I'm doubting my own past again, but yeah, but it's what a film. We'll have to get you back on for the other two.
Yeah.
And try not to talk about The Hobbit again.
No, that's the challenge. Not devolving into a Hobbit slag off session.
Oh,
that's our mission.
Yeah. So when's your next issue out? Is it your next podcast?
As we're recording on Thursday, it's out tomorrow, Friday the 6th of May. So I assume by the time this is out in the world, our Bilbo episode will be available for people to hear. If you go and look for Not Another Elf on social, you can track it down that way. And I'm actually just starting to edit the next one. So yeah, we're doing them every week on Fridays for 10 weeks for the first series. Then we're going to take a little break and do a second series.
Oh,
brilliant! When's Eowyn happening? Is what I want to know.
That is going to be somewhere in the first series. We're definitely doing Eowyn.
Excellent.
Yeah, we're doing one episode. Here's a scoop for this podcast. We're going to do an episode on Shadowfax, Gandalf's horse, which
yay!
A real challenge because he doesn't have any lines. So
that's brilliant.
Amazing!
What's an amazingly named horse, though? I think that's the best named horse ever.
Wow, Shadowfax the podcast. We've reached peak podcast, I think.
Somehow an hour on a horse.
Oh, brilliant.
That's amazing.
Catherine, we will put links in the show notes of our episode to all of your episodes so that it's easy for our listeners to find them. And I think we all recommend it extremely heartily because it's it's put together with a great deal of learning and understanding, but real genuine passion as well, and it's just incredible fun.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's introduced me to Brother Theodore, who I
that's true. Me too.
Who's just an incredible character.
Yeah,
who,
I love all of these weirdos that you find when you start digging into Tolkien ephemera. A lot of them very popular on US chat shows during the middle part of the 20th century for whatever reason.
Yeah. Brother Theodore was Boris Karloff, Salvador Dali, Nijinsky, and Red Skelton simultaneously, is how he was described. What a man. A German-American actor. But just incredible. One thing, have you heard of Figwit, Catherine?
Brett from Flight of the Conchords, yes.
Yeah. Because that's he didn't seem. I interviewed him over the phone. He didn't seem very happy when I mentioned Figwit.
Clang.
Many years ago. But Clang. But
he's probably worried that when he dies, that's going to be his obituary. You know, this sort of stupid bit of internet lore.
Figwit has died. Yeah. Do you guys know what Figwit is, Stella or Dan?
I know not.
No.
It comes from he's in the background at the Council of Elrond, and he's a very attractive elf, and he's Brett McKenzie from Flight of the Conchords, who is so he's attractive, but he's particularly attractive as an elf, and it comes from a message board. Somebody went, Frodo is great. Who is that? And he became known as Figwit. They were like watching it while messaging,
Right.
and so he became known as Figwit. So I have a page open on my screen of Figwit. His page.
Really?
I just think it's. For some reason, I just love little things like that.
It's one of those, I think, really early examples of fan service, because they then put more of him in Return of the King in response to this kind of
interesting
fan groundswell of like, this elf looks amazing.
Yeah.
Can we get more of the
more of that
elf?
Oh, okay.
Interesting.
Oh well.
Write that down as well.
Yeah, I was unaware of that. That's
and more Brett McKenzie.
That's something else to go Google that we'll have to put in the links.
Go and Google Figwit.
Just before we absolutely finish, Catherine, could I ask a favour of you? Could you please drop a name that will obliterate the names that Ian's dropped in the course of the episode? I think you're in a position to do so, having recently hosted the House of Gucci podcast.
I was going to give you a Lord of the Rings related one.
Oh, that's even better if you can.
Which is just that a friend of mine is quite good mates with Ian McKellen.
Ooh.
And so when the friend turned 30, I got invited to a small dinner party of about 10 people at Ian McKellen's house. And he made dinner for all of us. And we had dinner together, and Gandalf served us 3 kinds of pie. And I was just sat there the whole time trying not to lose it.
Wow.
That I was in the presence of someone that I considered to be a living god. But honestly, and he's putting on a little bit of a Gandalf voice in the films, but that basically is his voice.
Mm-hmm.
So extremely disconcerting to be just sort of sitting there, you're finishing up your starter, and then just at your elbow, more pie in voice.
All right, clang,
Yes,
clang.
I think that does it.
One of those evenings you can remember forever, really.
Yeah, I'm not surprised.
He's got a lovely house.
Oh wow!
Lots of Gandalf memorabilia.
Well, there we go.
And I never interviewed Ian McKellen, and I have actually met him. I served him a pint when I was a barman, and he was doing a play in Leeds.
Yeah.
And so that reminds you that he was well known before Lord of the Rings, because you kind of forget. But he's like, people are like, it's Ian McKellen. Fuck knows what he was in. Like, why even knew his name?
He was already knighted though before the Lord of the Rings, wasn't he?
Was he?
No, it was like 1995 or something.
Right.
And so people were going to see McKellen. So he was well known enough for something that people talked about him being in, and I served him a pint as a barman. But anyway, your story's slightly more impressive.
Well, yeah, Catherine, I was fishing for the name of a certain El Gaga there, because
you were after Lady Gaga, weren't you? Yes.
Wow.
Executive produced the House of Gucci official podcast in my other guise as not just a sort of Tolkien person who lives in an attic. I do occasionally venture out into the world and do things that I can actually make money doing.
They are good things.
But yeah, no, that was good. That worked well. We just won a Webby for that one.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, that was a great podcast. I don't know if you know Rhianna Dillon.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, occasionally appears on the Evolution of Horror podcast.
Yes, love Mike and Rhianna.
Oh, that's a great podcast. Yeah.
I used to exec Inside Cinema, which Mike produced for us and edited the BBC Strand for
Oh,
iPlayer.
yes, I've seen some of that. That's great stuff.
That was fun. We did 3 series of that.
All right. Oh, brilliant. But yes, Catherine, I just wanted you to drop Lady Gaga's name because there are major American Horror Story fans on this podcast. So,
me.
She was very professional.
Yeah.
And is there time for me to say how much I've enjoyed being on your podcast? This has been a total delight.
Apparently there is.
Always.
Well, thank you, Catherine. That's delightful.
And I really enjoyed the Martin episode with Dave Edwards, who's also someone that I've known since about hot dog era.
Yeah, I went to uni with David, and then we lost contact, and then we both were at a screening. I was like, "What are you doing?" "Oh, I'm here to review a film." "So am I." "Oh, turns out." We hadn't seen each other for about 5 years, and we both were at a screening, being critics. Yeah. I thought you knew David, yeah. But it's a small little pond, isn't it?
Yeah.
I saw him just the other day, and then we did Martin.
Oh, give him my best.
Well, Catherine, thank you so much. This has been delightful, and I think we'll have to find a way to mentally justify doing Two Towers and The Return of the King, even though they're less horrific movies. But on the other hand, The Return of the King does have a massive, scary spider in it, so.
It does.
Yeah.
And the orcs at Helm's Deep, they're scary, kind of.
Yeah, there's undead fellas, isn't there? Yeah, we can do it.
And there's an immolation, so
We could always do the Ralph Bakshi Lord of the Rings. That's more horrifying.
Oh yeah, that's true. In fact, I should finally watch all of it, and then we could do it as a missed classic. Yeah, oh, that'd be great because it's been 20 years, and it still haunts me. Okay, that's it for this episode of the podcast. Thank you very much for listening, everybody, and as an extra special thanks to Catherine Bray for giving us so much of her time and for such an enjoyable chat, which I hope you've enjoyed too. So the next episode coming up will hopefully be a first for this podcast. It will be an episode in which I'm not involved. Thank God, I hear you cry. Because I'm going to be away in Spain, it will be Ian and hopefully Stella and Kirsty as well, who will be present to discuss the new film by the team behind one of our favourite movies, Host, from 2020. Hopefully Ian and Stella and Kirsty will be talking to some members of that team and discussing the film. I haven't seen it yet. Maybe I will soon. I hope I will soon, but I probably won't be able to see it in time for the episode, so that's why I won't be there. But it's coming out at the end of next week, I think, June the 3rd. So watch out. It's already attracting acclaim and it sounds really intriguing. So hopefully you'll soon be able to hear that. I will be back on the following episode, which I know not what it may be. So on that note, thank you very much for listening once again. Please join us next time and take care of yourselves. Bye bye!
You have been listening to And Now the Podcast Starts. Produced and released by Ambidextrous Solutions Limited. Presented by Ian Winterton, Dr. Stella Gaynor, and T.D. Velasquez, with special guest Catherine Bray. And might I commend her taste in books and films. Special thanks to Greg Hume for our original theme music, and to Brian Gorman for our original artwork. All dialogue and music clips from films, TV shows, and trailers are used for the purposes of criticism in the spirit of fair dealing as defined in UK law, and fair use as defined in US law. No copyright infringement is intended. Please visit our home on the web, www.andnowpodcast.com, for more content and contact details. or visit our Facebook pages at And Now Pod or at Lee Cushing Pod. Follow us on Twitter at And Now Podcast or at Lee Cushing Podcast. If you'd like to donate to us, please visit patreon.com/And Now Podcast. And now the podcast stops.